Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. If we have not met, I think I have met most of you. I'm Sarah Hamiday. I'm in the Sustainability Division in SoMAS, and I am a disaster social scientist. Today, I am feeling a combination of excitement and big honor to introduce my very wonderful collaborator, colleague, Dr. Alex Greer from Stony at Albany. And without going into long descriptions, I will say throughout the years, leading his work on disaster recovery, on buyouts, on very thoughtful mixed method studies of disasters, I have had quite a few moments of this personal experience of reading a paper of Alex and thinking how smart, how difficult, and how thoughtful. So I am honored to have known and tried to work with Alex in different projects for the past 14 to 15 years. And his impact and his work is only growing, and I'm excited to watch, and I hope you all enjoy what he is going to share from a few of his projects today.
Thank you.
Welcome to Stony Brook.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you, Sarah, for the kind introduction. Nice thing was said about me in the last week, at least, so really appreciate that. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about my research, and specifically, I'm going to focus a lot on the project we're doing, looking at wildfires and place attachment, mostly in California, a little bit in Hawaii. So I'll talk about both those. So to give you a bit of a rundown, I'm going to start by introducing you to the topic, our research question, and the model that we adapted to pull forward the study. Then I'll tell you about the cases and why we chose them, walk you through what we've done to date, and while we're still processing a lot of this data, I'm going to give you some preliminary findings, overarching, and then go a little bit deeper on place attachment and what we found in relation to that concept. I'll talk a little bit about Lahaina and some preliminary work there, and then I'm going to close by giving you a few minutes on some other projects I'm working on too, in case there's any interest, talk about those during lunch or question and answer. So I started looking at housing recovery decisions after Hurricane Sandy, really not too far from here. So I was in Oakwood Beach on Staten Island. And I was really interested in how people were making housing decisions, how they're deciding where they wanted to live after a disaster. And so I had two communities at Oakwood Beach in Staten Island and at Seabright in New Jersey. And one thing that really emerged was this centrality of place attachment, or these socio-cultural bonds people form where they live, and how important that was in how they made their living decisions after disaster. And this is a concept that's pretty prevalent across a number of fields, but it hasn't been studied as much in disaster research, particularly compared to something like social capital, which has gotten a lot of attention in the disaster literature. So in thinking about where I'd want to study that next, a few things came to mind. One was, where might place attachment emerge the strongest? And the other was, how can we better measure place attachment? I'll come back to that concept here in a second. And as I was thinking through this, wildfires came to mind for a few reasons. First, wildfires, more so than any really other hazard agent, alter the physical environment, affecting the meaning that we ascribe to it. So we expect it to emerge strongly in that context for that reason. Second, we've had, and honestly continue to have, large wildfires in the U.S. context. And as you see from the table on the left hand of the slide, many of the largest wildfires in U.S. history have happened in the last 10 years. That's both in the area they've destroyed and also in deaths. And lastly, there's not a ton of hazard research, particularly relocation research, that looks at wildfire. So we have a lot to learn in that context. Mm-hmm. So I assembled a team. I have a geographer, Ronnie Schumann from University of North Texas, a social scientist at U.S. Forest Reserve, that's Dr. Miranda Mockren, and a community psychologist, Sherry Bender. And we started this baseline idea of, when homes are destroyed by wildfires, households have a decision to make. They can either rebuild in the same place in largely the same way. They can rebuild in the same place in a new way, so undertaking major mitigation measures, which might change the way that where they live looks, or they can relocate. And these decisions are driven by a number of different factors, but place attachment is a major factor in that decision-making process. And this is where the Mielov and Perkins model I have on the board came in handy. So this is for community psychology. And the idea is that when we think about place attachments, they can be disrupted multiple times. The first one, and this one being the environmental disruption itself. So in our case, a fire, which amplifies perceptions of place that we may not think about regularly. So we don't often sit around and think about what's so great about where we live, right? When we talk about it from time to time, it's not fresh in mind, but when it's threatened, it is. And so the disruption itself actually brings up those place catchment dimensions that may often be latent in someone's consciousness. In the interpretive phase, individuals and groups form narratives about what the event itself means. So in this case, what does the fire mean? And what does where we live mean now? What does it look like? What's it going to be? And so we form these kind of group narratives around what place is and how place is important, how we want to navigate that. In the response phase, we pick one of these three pathways I outlined earlier. So we relocate, path one, we rebuild without mitigating, path two, or we rebuild with mitigation measures, path three. And part of the thing I want to highlight here is that path one and three are recursive on the model. And so if you relocate, you're then having another disruption. You're then reconsidering place. But if you do major mitigation measures, like for instance, if you elevate your home for flooding, then you've also changed the way your neighborhood looks and you're renegotiating those bonds. So it pushes it back to the beginning again. And so this is where we really started with understanding this decision-making process. And when you think about where to study this, which is narrow down those pieces, Northern California made sense for a lot of different reasons. We had 4 counties, you can see them on the map here, but we had Butte, Lake, Sonoma, and Plumas counties. And they've all had major fires within the last 10 years. And so to give you a little bit of context, Sonoma had the Tufts fire in 2017, the Glass fire in 2020, killed a combined 28 people. Butte had the Camp Fire that killed 85 people in 2018. 60% of Lake County, which is quite a large county, has burned in the last 5 years. And that's by land area. So it takes 3 hours to drive across the lake. So it's had a lot of fires. And Plumas had the Dixie Fire in 2021, which burned over 1 million acres. And when I took my grad student there last year, we were driving through Plumas and she kept saying, is this the same fire? Was this the same fire? Because you drive and drive and drive, right? And it's just burned down the area. So a lot of landmass loss. The other thing that was interesting about these different cases was given the different time periods, they're in different phases of the recovery process. So we got to see that kind of across the spectrum. They're also different when you think about things like urban density, we think about socioeconomic status, we think about living in the WUI, the wildland-urban interface. These are all very different places. So we're able to see it from different perspectives as well. And also wildfire experience. The last thing I'll mention about that is all these fires had different causes. So we had some that were arson, we had some that were lightning, we had some that were like farming equipment, backfiring, things like that. So we had different etiologies for the fires as well. So let's talk about what we actually did. So we started with a pilot study. We wanted to understand the policy context a little bit better and make inroads into the community. And so we got a small grant from the Natural Hazards Center. And we ended up doing a pilot study where we interviewed policymakers about the wildfire context in the area and how things have changed since the fires. We ended up doing 37 interviews. It was local government, it was state government, it was nonprofits, it was community leaders. And then we leaned on that network we built through that, and we started to recruit households. And we did this a number of different ways. We did mailing lists, we did an email campaign, we did social media, we did a postcard in some of the counties we were having tougher times finding people. We worked a number of different avenues to try to find households that had the experience we were interested in. We did the intake survey, was how we started it. So we asked people, which one of the pathways are you on? Have you relocated or rebuilt? Have you done mitigation measures? What have you done? We asked them kind of where they were at in that recovery journey. So how far along are you? And we also asked them some basic demographics. So you can put people in different buckets and get people across the spectrum. Key criteria for us is that you had to have lost your house to qualify for the study. And you also couldn't be a renter. And we're really interested in renters. We think renters are often overlooked in the literature. They often have less agency in the recovery process. So they don't choose whether things get built back or not. We just had to limit the size of our study, and we didn't think they'd be comparable. But what I will say the good news about this is that my doctoral student just got a doctoral dissertation research improvement grant from NSF. And so she's been looking at renters in the same counties. So we're adding as a comparison piece. So she was in Sonoma 2 months ago. She's going back again next month. And so we're trying to patch that up and get the renters part as well. And so once we had their survey responses, we enrolled them in our photo voice study. So photo voice, if you're not familiar, is a disparate action research approach, history and public health largely. And what happens is participants generate photos that then you use in a guided interview process. And so you give them prompts, they take the photos, and then you lay them out at a table where you show them on Zoom, and you talk through them. And so they self-author the photos, they reflect on their experiences ahead of time, Photo taking gives them a means for gradual reflection on their experiences and their processes. It's also empowering because then they can tell their own story through pictures. They can use them later to advocate. So it has a very action research orientation for it, and healing as well, right, through the photos and through the narratives. So the first step is training. And so we did those in person and virtually, people that we enrolled. And we asked them to take pictures based on 2 prompts. I have them at the bottom of the slide. When we asked them to take pictures around their house about things that changed since the fire, kind of told their story, their recovery, and around their community of how things have changed since the fire. We let them take 28 photos because that's what a Polaroid will hold. And part of it was an equity argument, was that people didn't have cameras that they could use. We wanted to provide them with Polaroids. We had one person pick us up on that. So it wasn't really as much of a concern as we thought it might have been. But it also limited the amount of photos that we got so we could actually process them. The other thing that we did with that was we told people to use new and old photos. We wanted half of them to be new, because we wanted to actually reflect on the photo taking process. We also found a lot that people didn't have photos anymore. So a lot of younger people in the room probably obviously gets backed up automatically to iCloud or Google. A lot of our participants tend to be a little bit older, and so they didn't have that. And so we had so many people we talked to that said, I didn't have any old photos. I lost all those. Right? And so they didn't have those to bring to bear on the process. So we take those, we print them out, print out 2 copies of them, gave them one, kept one ourselves, and we end up putting numbers up in the corner. You can't really see in the picture very well, but there are numbers up in the corner, and we lay them on a table in front of us. And we led them through a guided interview process. If we did it through Zoom, then we ended up making something like what's on the right-hand side. We called it our battleship approach, right? So it'd be like, let's talk about B3, right? And we take that when we blow it up real big, we talk about it, we shrink it back down. And so we had them talk us through them. So we asked them things like, tell us about your experience with the disaster. Tell us about your experience with the fire. Where were you when it happened? Where'd you go next? How many places were you displaced to? When did you move? What triggered you to move? Where are you at today? And that's going to lay down a timeline for us. And then we asked them to use the photos, and we'd say, pick 2 or 3 photos that show us why you live where you live today. Pick 2 or 3 photos that show us high points in the process. Pick 2 or 3 that show us low points in the process. Pick ones that show us changes in the natural environment, changes in the social environment. Pick 2 or 3 that show us about your future. What do you see as the future of the community, the future of your home? And this was pretty intensive field work. This was about 12 weeks in the field, I'd say, for us across the team. One of our collaborators, Ronnie, ended up spending a sabbatical in Chico, just working on recruitment, getting our names known in the area, building trust, which was a big part about getting this project done. So when you look at who we actually talked to, we ended up having 70 households participate, 82 individuals overall. And what that tells you is that we had a lot of couples that wanted to sit down with us. And so we got to hear a lot of fighting in front of us, which was real interesting, because most of these happened in their new living rooms. And so we did some in hotel lobbies, we did some in Starbucks, but most of them were in their new living rooms. And so we had a lot of people who would be like, actually, that's not how it happened. That's not what we talked about. We also got the fun inter-household dynamics of I wanted this and they wanted this, and this is what we did, which is really important for what we were studying. So again, we had 70 total in California, 82 individuals participated, 9 fire events. So you see that over here in the cross section. Most common one was 4 years since the fire, so that's the campfire. But they span from 2 to 7 years post-fire, which gives us a nice kind of longitudinal look at it, knowing that, again, recovery is not linear. Diversity is really important in understanding what's driving decisions when. Regarding the residential status, we had 25 who relocated. And if anyone's done this kind of work, you know, it's very hard to find people who have moved. And so we're very happy that we got 25 who actually already relocated. We had 35 who had rebuilt or were already working on rebuilding. So they were in the process. And we had 10 that were still kind of in flux. They didn't quite know what they wanted to do. We also had a pretty good mix of kind of suburban and rural, way out in the wooey, or kind of in Santa Rosa, more of a city. So one thing we try to be really conscious of was to not be extractive, right? And we don't want to come in, take the data, and then just disappear again, right? We wanted to find ways to give it back. And that really is in line with the participatory action research approach of photo voice. And so what we did, and actually in our NSF budget, we budgeted for this, and I'm glad that it got to stay in there, was we did town halls in each one of our counties after the event. So we went home, we processed the data, we saw the preliminary overarching findings were, we went back and we showed it back to the community and we said, here's what we saw. What did we get wrong? What did we get right? And how should we tune this? And then what should we do with this to make it better for the next group that goes through this, unfortunately? And so we did one in every one of our counties. We're doing 5 total. So the 5th one is Maui, which I'll talk about in a minute a little bit. But these were really cool events. I had never done anything like this. It was very rewarding to get to do it. When we were in Paradise, they stood up and they said, over 300 studies that come through here, you're the first ones to come back and tell us what you found. And so it was really rewarding to be able to go back and do this, right, and show them what we had found. And so what we did was we built these posters. Essentially, there were about 12 posters. You can see them on our website. And they outlined kind of our overarching findings. And what we did on them was we used their photos, we used their quotes with pseudonyms, and we did them across the counties. So one thing that was cool that would happen is people would show up and they would be reading them and say, I thought that was me. That's actually the other county. That wasn't even this fire. And so they saw how similar a lot of their experiences were. The other really nice thing about this was we put forward policy recommendations based on what we saw. And we use those in a lot of different ways, which I can talk about later. But the town hall is really useful for those for providing more context for them. So sometimes we get, well, that would never work here, but it might work there, and here's why. Or if you tuned it in this way, this would be really helpful for someone in the future. And so we're able to really refine those policy recommendations based on those community sessions. That was really, really awesome for us. So I want to give you some preliminary findings, and then I want to focus on place attachment. But broadly, one thing I want to say that we found was that housing decisions were initially made very quickly. So most people knew within the first 2 or 3 weeks what they wanted to do. Doesn't mean that's what they did, but they had kind of reached the level of what they wanted to do. And I'd say almost everyone had made a decision within a year. They weren't back in a year, but they made a decision within a year. But I'd also say many of them later questioned that decision. So there were only a handful of people we talked to that said, yeah, I did it. I'm happy I did it. I would never make a different decision. A lot of people say, I came back, but the town never came back. And so I don't know how long I'm going to be here. Or I came back and I wake up and I go outside and see dead trees every day. I can't do that anymore. Right? Or there's a fire in the next county and it freaks me out and I'm on edge when it's windy. And so I can't do this anymore. Or I left and I really miss it. And I miss everyone. I feel like I can't recover when I'm not with the people who are also recovering. So a lot of people regretted their decision. We heard a lot about that idea of nostalgia too, right? That pull of memory and grief for what is lost was present in both people who stayed and people who have left. The other thing we saw a lot too was that fires accelerated life transitions for a lot of people. So if they were already thinking about moving, for instance, fire gave them a great opportunity to move. They would say, well, I was already out of here, was getting older, didn't make sense for me to live this far out anymore. And then when the fire happened, I took that opportunity, I moved. But we also heard things like, if you were thinking about retiring, you probably retired with fire, right? The stress was too much. If you were having a rocky marriage, it did not help with that, right? The additional stress of recovery was tough for a lot of people. We heard a lot about divorces or almost divorces because of the stress of the fire, but it was often accelerating pre-event conditions for people. We also heard if you were thinking about changing professions, this was a chance to do it, right? So it's accelerated what was already happening for a lot of people. But one thing we saw over and over was that these narratives came back to kind of a push or a pull, right? A push out or a pull to a new place. And that place attachment or those kind of bonds they have with the environment really drove a lot of that. So let's go a little bit deeper on that piece. So place attachment, the concept, largely comes from high amenity literature, economic geography. And it was largely developed to think about things like why you vacation where you vacation at. And so what pulls you to go to the beach every year. But it also has roots in psychology too. So you can look at the journals that publish it. It's usually geography or psychology. Psychology comes at it from a little different angle. It's largely from identity, right? So it starts with ideas of like, how does a toddler know that their hands are their hands, but the floor is not them too, right? So how do I conceptualize self? And then how does place influence my conceptualization of self? So how much of living here influences who I think I am versus just who I am? And so detangling those two. And given that kind of multidisciplinary nature of the concept, it's been conceptualized in a bunch of different ways. So most of it will go back to Williams and Vask or Roger Buck, late 80s, early 90s. And they'll think about 2 dimensions. I'll say place dependence, which is kind of those functional dimensions of place. So is it close to work? Is it affordable? Those kind of things. And place identity, right, which is the formation of self. Others add other pieces though. So someone talk about things like definition. And so what makes this place unique compared to other places? Others will talk about things like affect, right? So there's negative or positive emotions that come along with place. Others talk about things like nature bonding, for instance. So how does love of nature and being close to nature affect attachment to place? Small area of the literature, early 90s, Hammond talks about negative dimensions. They're not so commonly appearing in the literature. Talk things like alienation. I'll talk about things like place relativity. So this place isn't as good as other places compared across. Talk about detachment, or placelessness, like you don't have a home. But that literature is not as prominent. But all of it does come back to this idea of place. And since disasters threaten place and destroy place, it's been pretty prominent in disaster literature. And I put the disaster scholarship in kind of two buckets. One is, how do disasters affect place attachment? It's kind of having place attachment as the dependent variable. Or how does place attachment affect mitigation and recovery decisions? And this is kind of flipping and making it the IV. And on the recovery angle, there's kind of two approaches the literature has taken. One is, I am so attached to this place that I will come back and I will make it better than it ever was before. And I will commit myself to it. And you see this in a lot of examples. It's kind of therapeutic community after disasters, this love of place being strengthened by the event itself, showing you what you cared about before. The other dimension, though, is this idea maybe of avoiding mitigation measures because you don't want to change what place looks like. And so when I was doing work at Seabright, I heard about this a lot of people saying, yeah, we should probably elevate, but I don't want to look like so-and-so town down the coast, right? I don't want to be on these 20-foot stilts. It's not what my town looks like, so I don't want to do that. And so there's kind of these two approaches that it can often take in the literature. So to look at this, what we did was we went back, looked at all the literature on place attachment, we looked at all these different conceptualizations, looked at all the different dimensions, and we took that and we used it as a deductive code book placed on our photo voice data. And so we took these dimensions, we built it into in vivo, and we said which one of these dimensions emerges and is prominent in the narratives about recovery. And we also coded, and this is part of the innovation of the study that was fun, was we coded scale as well. So if they said that they had strong nature bonding, right, they wouldn't use those words, but that's what they were getting at. Was it to the nature in their backyard, or was it to the nature in the local area? Where was that nature located at? And part of the reason we kept coming back to this was in the interviews, we kept being stunned at how much it was just about their home, right? It wasn't about the local area, it was often about their home. And so we got really interested in how has the place attachment literature handled scale in the past? And the answer is it really hasn't. A lot of times they will have like a single unit, but they won't talk about place attachment at different levels. And so we coded where it was evident. What level was it at? Were they talking about the home? Was it talking about the community? Was it the neighborhood? Was it the local area? Where was that happening at? And part of the reason that might be useful is because if you're thinking about ways to encourage people to come back, you know what level they're going to care about. And so that's what we were thinking about when we were going through it that way. So looking at it broadly, we saw evidence of all those dimensions throughout those 70 narratives, but nature bonding, so this kind of love of nature, place identity and place dependence were the most prominent features that we saw throughout the narratives. We also saw these often overlapped and they were difficult to pull apart. And I'll show you some of those quotes here in a minute where same quote, you could draw a couple different conclusions from it. That's particularly true with nature bonding and how it bridged identity and dependence. The fourth dimension here, detachment, again, one that's a little less prominent in the literature, but we saw it a lot in the narratives, which makes a lot of sense with our context. So what I want to do is I want to use the next few slides to walk you through some of these dimensions. And what you'll see is I have a quote there, I have a name, it's a pseudonym, and I have a county, the county's correct. The quote is from the individual, the picture is also from the same individual. And where it made sense, where they reference the photo, I've given you the same photo too. So place identity, right, or this kind of idea of identity formation or how to influence sense of self was probably the most prominent dimension that we saw across the narratives. And this came through in how they talked about their connections after the fire. So heard people talk about familial and personal history in an area. They talk about their ties to the specific property itself and the surrounding area. They talk about generations raised on the property in the area and the memories they had made that resulting in these strong place bonds. And you see that in Alice's comment. So Alice was from Sonoma County. She lost her home in the Tubbs fire in 2017. And Alice had to rebuild her home, but she'd rebuild it to give it to her son. And she talked about all the memories that her son had made there, her and his late father had made there. She moved in with her boyfriend after the fire, but she rebuilt the home and sold it back to her son so he could live there with his new family. And so she said it's very important that I have it back. You can see the sense of justice in her that she didn't choose to sell the house, it was taken from her. And she wanted it back to have that kind of family lineage there. You can also see in Leslie's comments. So Leslie's from Plumas County, so that's Dixie Fire 2021. And we saw a lot of these pictures that were kind of like gates or stairways to nowhere. So people share with us. It was in the entryway to their property. And Leslie's narrative I like because it pulls apart the idea of the structure itself and what happened on the property. And so for her, what had happened on the property and the history on the property is what was important to bring back. She wasn't coming back because of the physical building or the physical house. It was the land, right? It was the history, it was the community there. So that distinction between house and place became really important for us to understand the rest of them too. This also emerged in the ideas of stewardship and identity. So we heard a lot from people like Bill and Cindy about how, so they lost their home to campfire in 2018. They noted the broader history in the area. They noted the history of the people who had come through and settled. They also noted the Native American history in the area and how they felt like it was their duty to rebuild it and preserve it for the next generation. And as it ties to the history in the area, it was important for them to rebuild it for those reasons too. They also talked a lot about deep ecological and cultural heritage of the area and how important it was to preserve that. We also saw how identity often intertwined with functional dependence and nature bonding people to shape the recovery decisions. So Julie from Lake County is an interesting one. She lost her home in the Valley Fire in 2015, which was one of our oldest fires in our sample. And Julie's narrative, I know it's a little bit longer, but the bolder piece is what's really important. She talks about how she had family history in the area, and that was where she's from. She had lived in San Francisco for a while, worked in tech, came back when she was having kids. She said that she thought a childhood should contain sunshine, soil, and community, and that that place gave them all those things. And so you can see how that bridges all three of those dimensions of she wants the community, she has that identity there, she has the history, but the sunshine and the soil, right? These are more nature bonding pieces. And for Julie, being able to see the mountain from her house and that connection was really important. We heard this a lot. People would say, well, we built in the same place, but I turned the house. And I changed the orientation because now my view's different. And so now we'll be able to see the sunset, for instance, or we'll be able to see the mountain, where I couldn't have done that before. And so people talk about how they couldn't imagine living life without that view now. So place dependence, moving on, the functional ties to place also surfaced quite a bit through the interviews, particularly when people talked about their homes in the local area. So participants talked about living that wild and urban interface, and that's a choice, and that is a challenge that they take on. And it's called a pride in doing that. They talk about the solitude it gave them, the sense of independence. A lot of them were off the grid. A lot of them had septic tanks, so they didn't have anything to rely on from the city. And it gave them that space to be self-reliant in that context. They also talked about the local recreational activities. You think about Central and Northern California, right? You think about those kind of being able to get out in nature, and they talked about that a lot. They talk about being able to go hiking, biking, camping, all these kind of things in that local area. So you can see this in Abby's narrative here. So Abby says she got it for the dogs, right? So Abby trained dogs, and she wanted a big backyard where she could train dogs. She just like to be able to go out her backyard and go on a hike, and that was really important for her to be able to be that close to nature. Stewart, on the other hand, was in Plumas County, and so Stewart wanted to have a shop in his house. He worked on his cars, so he wanted to have that kind of piece to it. But he also wanted that kind of space. He wanted proximity. This was a tough one for them. So he wanted space to be able to have privacy, but he wanted proximity to be able to walk his daughters to school every day, and privacy at the same time. We heard a lot about privacy being a challenge with losing the trees. Stewart's an interesting case because Stewart and his wife both lost separate homes because they were not living together when the fire happened. They both lost separate homes. And part of the reason they lived separate was because Stewart said that his daughters couldn't imagine another woman cooking in their late mother's kitchen. And so when the fire happened, he said, well, there was no longer a kitchen. And so they moved in together, right? So it was like this kind of bittersweet trade-off of now I can live with my wife and not, go against what my daughters want. But it was an interesting case of them having to negotiate on, okay, well, we never lived together. So what does our house together look like? And so it's a whole extra level they had to negotiate together on that. We also saw participants talking about their new homes as a series of trade-offs. The trade-offs was a prominent word that often they used for us. And we saw that both in people that rebuilt and people that relocated. And this often had to do with practical realities of rebuilding. So this, for a lot of them, particularly our later fires, they're rebuilding in peak COVID. You guys remember what happened to building materials in peak COVID? It was crazy. It's even more crazy when you're in a disaster zone. And so often the cost of building materials made it to where they figured out their insurance was inadequate. And even if it wasn't before, it certainly was with the increase in building costs. There's often a lot of clauses in the insurance too. They had to build in the same footprint to receive their money. And so a lot of them said, I'm trapped here because of that, because I don't have enough money to then make a different decision. So it restricted their housing decisions and often decreased what we'd argue is their functional dependence on place or how much place met their needs. You see this in Leonard and Trish here, right? They said, they had rebuilt, they said like we would downgrade so much, right? We didn't do that. And they didn't want to trade off some of the solitude, some of the independence they got with their home. They just think they're kind of negotiating when they were figuring out where they wanted to live after the event. I will say though, to provide a little bit of counterbalance evidence on this, we did hear other times that this was a good trade-off for people. And this was often framed as the fire led to a point where they could meet their current needs better in their lives. This is particularly true of the elderly population that we interviewed. And I really like this one from Monica and Jen. They wanted an old farmhouse, is what they called it, right? So they wanted single story, they wanted wide doors, they end up in a wheelchair, right? They wanted to have that opportunity to rebuild accessibility in mind. Or Samuel from Lake County. So Samuel in Lake County, he had a really beautiful house in Lake, but it was 3 stories and it was basically all glass. He lost it in the lake fire. And when he moved to a place that was a single story, so him and his wife could age there. That was really important to him too. And so these stories, they kind of show how dependence can change with age, which I think is an important thing to think about when thinking about housing. So moving to nature bonding, when talking about where people lived before and where they lived after the fire, they're often highlighting natural beauty in the region and how that was central to them. Views, as I mentioned earlier, and their deep knowledge of the physical environment. And you see this in Atlanta from Butte County. We got a lot of pictures of deer and wildlife, a few pictures of bear, which scared the crap out of my GA. She did not want to go because she was worried about running into a bear. And so like, you're just as likely to run into a bear as you are in places you're going, like in Albany, you don't need to worry about this. But they were very concerned about this, right? But they talked about this proximity to nature and this relationship with the natural environment being really important to how they conceptualize their self and their attachments. You can see in Maryland's quote from Plumas, right, the tree identification, fir, pine, cedar. You can see them talking through this. Another one here where, again, I was stunned by the knowledge of trees. I had to brush up on my tree knowledge really quick. I was getting embarrassed in interviews. People really knew their trees. They really knew them. So Emily from Sonoma, she lost her house in a Tubbs fire. And Emily talks about how she talks about her trees like she knows them. A lot of them she does. And so she knew every tree on her property. She knew what species they were. She knew how to care for them. And they often tied this up in ideas of stewardship, but also in relating the recovery of the nature to their own recovery. I'll come back to that in a minute because that came up a lot. So participants often tied this together. So it'd say, as nature recovers, I recover. Nature doesn't recover, I don't recover. And you can see this in Henry and Inga's story. So they lost their home in the glass fire. They lived on a intentional community. And so we often call them communes, right? They lived in an area where everyone kind of bought in and they all lived together. And they actually ran one of them. And what they talked about was that they had this deep knowledge of tree identification. They would plant trees when their children were born. They'd plant trees whenever their parents died, often olive trees. And so watching those come back and making sure that they did was really important to them. They also hosted Cub Scouts that came by and did plantings. And they would say, come back in 20 years and see what you planted. Right? So they really try to get people in touch with that. And they saw this nature therapy as something that was just going to bring them back through the recovery process too. While there was a lot of loss and devastation, if you've ever seen wildfire damage, there's often kind of pockets of untouched nature. Sometimes they're just an acre big or something, right? But fire kind of jumps. And so there were a lot of these pockets in communities. And people would talk about really relying on those pockets to give them hope or to imagine what the rest is going to look like again one day. So in Paradise, we often heard about daffodils, which was the town flower, and how miraculously they came up everywhere after the fire. In Lake, it was often sunflowers. They talk about how those quicker plants would give them a lot of hope about the future. And most of them understood it was going to take a long time, but they tied up their recovery and the recovery of the plants. So Tammy from Sonoma County here, that was her home that needed rebuilding. She rebuilt in the same spot. She did a lot of mitigation, but she was in the same spot. But she talks about how she anthropomorphizes the landscape. That's probably my favorite quote that I have in the entire set. About how at first when you see your friend, you go, oh, my poor friend, they're so grossly disfigured. But then they were just your friend again. And so she really anthropomorphized the landscape, thought about recovery as you would a person, and understood that it would take a long time. Neil down here, right, says it's ugly in many ways, and we have to dream the beauty. And it's kind of looking past what's there today and holding on hope that that will recover a lot. And then we heard that over and over. So again, while a lot of conceptualization of place attachment don't really deal with the negative dimensions, we saw a lot of it. And it's likely due to our context. But we saw a lot of cases where survivors would say that their place attachments were diminished by the fire itself. And this came up a lot in relations with neighbors and how they were often strained after the fire, and that really got in the way of the recovery. So Grace from Butte County, this is campfire. So Grace was a single mom. She lived in Chico now. Chico is about 30 minutes from Paradise, just down Skyway. And she talked about how she still go back to church in Paradise. And as she went, and then one day it was windy outside, which put everyone on edge. We heard about that quite a bit. And so the lady grabbed her and said, why did God do this to us? Right? What do we do to make this happen? And she said she realized that her cup was just empty. And she didn't have any more to give anyone. That she couldn't recover in that kind of context. And that was really pushing her to not go back anymore. So she didn't go to church anymore. She didn't really go up to Paradise anymore. Interestingly enough, she still owns the property and is still thinking about rebuilding it one day. But for now, she says she can't go back. It's just not a place where she feels like she can recover. Survivors also told us about these kind of subtle visual reminders that put them back in that headspace and challenge their ability to move on for the fire. So this is Coffee Park, which is a fairly famous area in Sonoma. It was destroyed in the Tubbs fire in 2017. And Coffee Park was an area you wouldn't really expect to burn. It's kind of like right in the middle of Santa Rosa. And in this story from Carmen, right? Carmen tells us about when you go for walks, everything's new, it's pretty, it's nice. They're one of the fastest areas to rebuild. There's a lot of stories about them because they had like this one builder, everybody got the same house. She said that there's these little black squares on the ground everywhere. And that comes from the fact that it was trash day when the fire came through, and so those are melted trash cans. And she said, you can't pressure wash it away, you can't scrape it away. They're eventually going to have to repave it. She said, so you walk around, everything's nice and pretty, but you still have that visual reminder of what happened that day. People also, like Cora from Plumas County, so that's again Dixie Fire, talk about how it fundamentally damaged or challenged their relationship with nature. And so she talks about these dead trees around. They call them widowmakers because they often fall and kill people. And they're also toxic, so they're challenging to get out of there. And so they often just stay for a long time. Talks about seeing those as a visual reminder. It feels like you're walking on a Martian landscape. You're not even on Earth. And it challenged their ability to recover. So she actually moved to Nevada. She was like, I'm not even deal with trees at all. She got away from it all. She was not gonna see them. We also saw that the damage often challenged how people conceptualized place. And this was really pointed in Greenville with the Dixie Fire. So Greenville was about 2,000 people lived there before the Dixie Fire. It destroyed every building but one in the town. The one building it didn't destroy was the Plumas County Bank. I had a lot of meetings in the Plumas County Bank, and they had this big banner on the back wall that said, "We're here for good." And they shut down maybe 6 months after I started having meetings there. It was the last Plumas County bank in Plumas County, so they still exist. There's no more in Plumas County. And there's a lot of because population isn't there anymore. They have no one to serve. And they said that they had a lot of meetings about what the community should look like in the future. It has a history of being a logging and gold mine town. And so it kind of had that stagecoach kind of look to it. And they said they had all these architectural students from around the world come in and show them what their town should look like. They have like these really cutting edge modern breweries that were all glass and 2 levels. And they're like, no one's going to go there. Who's going to go there? But that's not what we want. And so there's a lot of concern about when it comes back, what will it look like? It will look like the place that I came from, right? Will it serve my needs? And so a lot of concern about what that was going to look like in the future. We also heard people like Helen in Lake County about how it was really disorienting with the fire and difficulties navigating the area. So she talked about how her parents grew up there. They never came back anymore. She thought it was because they wouldn't recognize it. And she says that she was never a turn by the tree kind of person. And so, you go up there, you turn by the 3rd tree. She said, but then she realized she was because she got lost in her own community over and over. And so that kind of disorientation with the fire is something we haven't seen a lot in the literature, but I think is really prominent in these contexts and important to think about of how much it changes the way you understand place. So bringing this part all together, I want to highlight 3 key findings. First, place permeated the recovery narratives. Right? We asked for it in a lot of cases, but it was certainly there. We saw place identity often manifest at the home level, which is not too surprising because identity being where you grow up, where you make memories, it's there. But ideas of stewardship being really important too for the home was a little bit surprising. Place dependence and nature bonding often overlap significantly and were even hard to pull apart in a lot of the quotes. And it's likely due to the fact that they live in this rural, woozy setting by choice. And so they wanted to live in nature, they wanted to be self-reliant. Those two things went hand in hand for a lot of people. These ideas of biophilia, or kind of love for nature or being close to nature, was incredibly prominent. People wanted to seek connection, or even be pushed away from that. I'll talk about that more in a second. Uh, and that was particularly surprising that it was so much to the home. So it was recreational activities at the home or access from the home that came up a lot. We would have thought that would have been more in the local area, so I'm glad we coded for that to see where it was. A second piece is we saw a lot of evidence that fire led to a redefinition of place. And in some cases, it deepened those bonds with nature, deepened those bonds with place, right? People wanted to be there, they wanted to be part of the effort. So they couldn't imagine being anywhere else where this was happening. No one would understand them. Others worked really hard, as they described it, to find the beauty in a dead tree. And so they were looking for that beauty there. And some struggled to find it. And they talk about how it challenged their ability to recover. But in almost all cases, people had to reconsider the functional dimensions of place. So is it still good for recreation? Right? Is it still good for my kids to grow up in? Is it still private? Does it meet my needs at my current life stage? Right? These are all things that people are navigating. We heard a really interesting example. So one of the pictures from Sonoma earlier, she said that she had built her house kind of off the grid, but she had the firefighters come and actually framed on her property. They would roll out toilet paper on her hill and spray it because that kind of is a good proxy for how quick it takes to knock out a fire. And then when the fire happened, they didn't come. They ended up defending the neighborhood below her. And she said, if I can't be safe, what am I doing here? And so the compromise she had found, which was interesting, was she had rebuilt her home at about $700 per square foot. So if you bought a home or built a home, that's crazy. Like, it's very high. And what she had was she had 18-inch thick walls. She had metal drop doors that came down at certain temperatures. They were automatic. She had full-on sprinkler system integrated into her roof. And she said, I'm going to build a fortress. Right, this is my answer. And then she also bought a house in Oregon where she goes for 6 months. So she's kind of found that middle ground for her. Right? People are reconsidering these bonds. They're reconsidering how they do this. Lastly, we saw a lot of evidence of detachment in the narratives. And again, one of the criteria is you had to lost your home. So not super surprising that we would then find that. But we saw a lot of evidence of social conflict after the fires. And we also said natural events don't have that as much. So it was interesting to see that. And we saw a lot of challenges of living with visual reminders of the fire. We also saw this kind of disorientation, which I haven't really seen anywhere, where this change in the natural environment, change in the setting, led to a bit of disillusionment and often avoidance with the setting. So we are not done. We ended up getting a supplemental grant from NSF to add Lahaina as a case study. So we remember the 23 Lahaina fire, 101 deaths, grass fire. A lot of it had to do with evacuation routes and warning systems. And so when that fire happened, actually NSF reached out to us and said, you're doing this study. Would you want to add a case study? Would you want to go there too? And we said, absolutely. So when we had Siri Bender on the team, did her PhD at University of Hawaii. So we already had built-in connections there. And so we partnered with a local organization, the Maui Housing Huey, which formed after COVID, because there was a lot of housing discrimination happening on Maui. And it was particularly toward single mothers. It's illegal to discriminate against someone for having kids, but they're often finding people couldn't find homes and they had kids. They didn't want to deal with it as landlords. And so they ended up fighting for those individuals. And then when the fire happened, they shifted their mission and spent a lot of time helping fire survivors find housing too. And so we partnered with them to find individuals to interview. A couple changes from the other study though. So we didn't do photo voice, we just did interviews. A little too fresh, a little too challenging to get photos. A lot of people weren't even back in the area. So we just did interviews with individuals. We've done 14 so far. We're still adding a few, still working on expanding that. The other change that we did was we did renters and homeowners. And part of this is just a practical reality. Lahaina, 70% of the survivors were renters, and there were about 14,000 people affected. So it's really hard to find enough homeowners to check that box. And so we've done 14. We had our town hall discussion in August of last year. And we only made one real pass through the data, but a few things I want to highlight that kind of contrast with what I said earlier. So nature bonding is a lot less evident. It's just a different kind of setting. And so we didn't see people talking about the natural environment nearly as much as we did in our other sample. But identity was almost stronger. And a lot of that comes with the history of the area, the history of colonialism, the fact that sugarcane coming to the area then led to different kinds of grasses, which then led to the fire. Right? So a lot of that tied up in what led to the fire, the history of the area. There's a lot of challenges with dependence and definition. And so Lahaina was fairly working class. It was the old capital. had a really nice front street area you could walk down. Is that going to come back? What's that going to look like? It was already unattainable for a lot of people, and when we built back rental housing, we actually built it more expensive. So again, the same people still come back. Was a lot of discussion that we were hearing. We also heard a lot of questions about who gets to define what Lahaina looks like. So is it outsiders? Is it locals? And then what is a local? So we talked to a lot of people who say, I came here when I was 6 months old. I came here when I was 5. But because I can't name back my Native Hawaiian lineage, I don't get any say in the recovery effort. Alternatively, we talk to people who are Native Hawaiian and they would say, no one's listening to me either. So there's probably a lot of talking past each other. Perhaps no one had a say. But there was a lot of that idea of identity and how much influence you need to have in recovery. And then who gets to come back once it's all built back, which in a lot of cases it still isn't today. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, I think I have a couple left. I do want to zip through a few other projects, give you some ideas of what I'm working on. One thing that we just launched is a phase 2 of the Lahaina study. And so I'm working with the Maui Housing Huey. So a group that both myself and Dr. Hamade are involved is the National Income Housing Coalition. Did some seed grants that actually Walmart funded, which is pretty cool. Small grants to put a nonprofit and a researcher together to study an issue. And so what we propose with Maui Housing Huey is we kind of cast this as the first part of the Lahaina piece is there's this framework in migrational literature about capabilities and aspirations in moving. And what it argues is that you have aspirations about what you want to do. You have capabilities of what you can do. And those two come into conflict and they kind of determine where you end up. And so what we've argued is that the first phase of Lahaina data has been aspirations. It's so close to the fire. We're trying to figure out what people want to do. The second phase is going to be capabilities. What is stopping you from doing what you wanted to do? And so we're going to do focus groups. We're going to do 4 to 6 of them. I think they're going to start in May. And sit down with a bunch of renters and talk to them about what they wanted to do, what they ended up doing, and what's stopping them from doing what they want to do. And so we're going to end up working through that. It's going to be really interesting. We're trying to develop really actionable piece of information. And part of what we propose to do is to take some of our survivors to Oahu, to a legislative session to tell their stories. And so we're trying to build that into. It's a little more advocacy than I've been involved in the past. I'm really excited about education, not advocacy. That's the terms we have to use. So it's more education than anything else. Second one, I have a 3-year National Science Foundation project that I just launched in January with Tristan Lin now, who's an urban planner at University of North Texas. And Yuki Lee is a quantitative scholar. She's one of my former students. She's now at Skidmore. And this is a really fun project. We're trying to address this kind of fundamental question in disaster literature. So if you look at the risk literature, particularly around risk analysis in that journal, there was this big fight that happened in the early 2010s about what leads someone from intending to do something to actually doing something. So do the same factors matter? Is it a different set of factors that sweep in and make that kind of transition? And part of the challenge with a lot of our literature is if we're studying disasters, you don't really get to pick when those happen. You can't give pre-post data. And so if exposure is one of the major variables, you can't really capture that neatly. And so what we're trying to do is to look at what moves someone from intending to do something about a flood to actually doing something about a flood. So the way we're doing that is we're partnering with YouGov, which is a survey research firm, and we're checking every 6 months with the same individuals for 3 years. So we're asking about what kind of adjustments they've made, what they're thinking about making. We're asking about a number of different things about their hazard history. We're asking about life changes, which is the thing that the literature says might be important. So maybe you get a better job and you have more sustainable income. Maybe you get married, maybe you have kids. Maybe a parent moves in with you, right? All those kind of things that may affect whether you want to do to adjust for your hazard risk. And we also have a little pot of money in case flooding or hurricane happens in a region. We can do a more targeted, bigger sample to have another comparison piece. And so it's interesting to me, a lot of fun. It's quite different, but it gets another one of those fundamental questions. And the last one I want to mention is one that we started about, it's like 18 months ago now. So this was part of the DISIS EX competition that NSF had. So DISIS is Dynamic Interdependent Social Environmental Systems. And this project is with Elise Daybars, a geographer, Ronnie Schumann, or not Ronnie, Sherry Bender again, who's a ecologist, and Jason Martini, who's an ecologist. And so what we're trying to understand in this project is how land acquired through buyout programs does or doesn't contribute to community resilience. And if you're not familiar, buyouts are property acquisition programs that often happen in the wake of flooding events. The government will buy your property for pre-event value, and move you out of the area. And then they're supposed to leave that land open in perpetuity. Now, open could be a number of different things. It could be a vacant lot that they mow 8 times a year, or it could be a park or a detention basin or something like that, where there's not a permanent structure, but it serves a community function. And we've been doing work on this for a while. And part of what we got really interested in this for was we did a lot of work in Houston looking at how households were making decisions around whether they participated or not and how government was designing these programs. And part of what we learned was that there was a big disconnect between the group that was buying the homes and the group that was then managing the properties in the long term. So when we talked to the group that was buying the homes, they said, oh, yeah, we talk to those people all the time. They know exactly what they'll do when we get a property. And so they get it, they flip it real quick. It's got an awesome land use for the neighbors. So we talked to those guys. Yeah, sure. We talked to them. They said they never talk to us. They just show up and they say, here's a list of properties you now own. Do something with them. And we often don't have plans for them. So Harris County, that's where Houston is, has bought probably around 4,000 properties now through purple acquisitions. Their mowing budget for those properties, which are ones that they've not done anything with, is to mow them, is over $1 million a year. And so they're spending so much money just mowing them and not actually doing anything with them. But when you look at the buyout literature, particularly the buyout literature that happens at kind of 30,000-foot view, looks at managed retreat, they don't kind of acknowledge this piece of it, right? They think about whatever they put down on paper they're going to do with the property, not what actually happens to the property. So there's no follow-up where when the federal government funds it, they come back and say, oh, did you do what you said you're going to do with it? That never happens. And so what we're doing is we're trying to pick the ideal cases where something good would have happened and see if it is happening. So most of the literature will say it takes about 10 years from the moment you buy the property for something to actually happen on it. And so we picked areas in central Texas, mostly after 98 to 2002 flooding. And we're trying to figure out things that happen there. So we have 4 pieces of it. One, we're documenting the land use. So is it a soccer field? Are people actually playing on it? Is it a detention basin? What's actually happening there? The second piece is that we are looking at the different ecological dimensions of resilience that could be happening there. So our ecologist is doing things like avian life. He's looking at pollinators. He's looking at water capture, carbon capture. He's doing soil samples, all kinds of fun things that I can't do, but fascinating. And we're going in 2 months, and we're installing temperature sensors around the property to see if it lowers the ambient temperature of people walking around. And so is it serving that kind of ecological resilience benefit? The third piece is we're talking to neighbors, right? Because if you weren't the property that's bought out, your next door neighbor is probably the most affected by it. And so we're going and we're knocking on doors and we're saying, what do you think about it? Do your kids play on it? Is it a great, is it a benefit to you? Is it an amenity? Or is it an eyesore? Are you worried about crime from the street lights? Does it still flood? Did it help you at all? Do you even know what happened there? And so we're talking to neighbors. And the last piece of it, we're talking to policymakers. And we're trying to learn about how they're thinking about the land uses. Are they beneficial to the community? Are they thinking about it holistically with all the land they own, or is the buyout property different? And one of the fun things that's been happening there is we've been learning that we miss a lot of them because they're not in the databases that are out there. So we'll call them and they'll say, do you care about the other 10 we bought? Like, what other 10? Right? Or we'll say, get these from buyouts, and they say, those come from buyouts. We didn't know that. Right? So that institutional memory is often not there. But we want to understand a little bit about how they're seeing the properties and if they're helping them meet their goals. So that's what I have. I really enjoyed getting to talk to you today. I'm happy to field any questions you might have.
We have Raji and Jared asking the first question. All right.
Thanks for talking about it. It was great. So I have one question. I'm just interested in renters and those who don't have clear title. So how does place attachment differ for them? Like, does the photo voice process reveal a different kind of attachment on different scale for those people who don't necessarily own the building or the properties?
Yeah. So one thing that we expected, and part of what you have been seeing, is that this idea of agency in return has been a major sticking point for a lot of people. Because if you're a homeowner, as long as you have the resources, it's your decision as what you do, right? Whether you come back or not. If you're a renter, you're relying on someone else to rebuild the unit and also rebuild it in the same way and rebuild it at the same price so you can come back. And so that's been a major discussion point with my PhD student, which she's been collecting the data, is what are you hearing about those kind of things? What's been interesting though is when she's been debriefing me after her interviews, it's a lot of the same concerns, right? Because a lot of these people have lived there for 10, 15, 20 years. And so they talk about how much they missed being in the local area. They talk about the communities they had built there. They talk about the same kind of dimensions. It's just they often don't get to make the decision. You get back to that capabilities aspirations framework. they're a lot more constrained on their capabilities, but often their aspirations are the same.
So that like they have like higher aspiration, but then they don't have enough capability.
Maybe that they lack the ability to actualize their aspirations in the same way. They don't have much agency to make those decisions, but the motivators are often the same. What we see. Yeah. That's a good question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I learned a lot that I did not speak about. Thank you. My question is with the accelerating intensity and frequency of wildfires, for example, California and Texas, do you expect to be a shift in people's ideas away from nature bonding, place identity, and place dependence into detachment with repeated wildfires at some point before there's going to want to be?
That's a great question. And I do think that there is something to say the first one feels like a fluke, the second one doesn't feel like a fluke anymore. We had 3 people in our sample, I want to say, that had experienced more than one fire that they lost their home in. And so you start the interview and say, which fire affected you the most? And they're like, which one do you want to talk about? So we had one lady who had lost her home twice in Butte County and then in Greenville as well. Right? And so she said, it feels like the fire is following me. Right, everywhere I go, I'm getting hit by fire. So she was in a 2017 fire. She was in Paradise, and then she was in Dixie. And you do see a lot of that of people that have had that or they've had near misses, and they say no more. Right. And so when I talked about people making decisions and regretting it, that's what we heard a lot was, I really want to be part of this. I wanted to be part of the rebuilding. I wanted to be there for it. But then there was that fire that just missed us. Or, I have the watch alert app now and I see them all, or I hear a helicopter go over and that puts me on edge. And I think when my kids graduate, I'm out of here. And so we heard that a lot too, of like that stress that comes afterwards that they didn't really expect, because that might push them out. So to your question, with increasing wildfires, increasing exposure, you certainly could see more of that happening because it does cause you to renegotiate them every time it happens. And even with those near misses, you often think about it quite a bit.
Hi, I really loved your talk. I just wanted to go back to your Hawaii case study, like on Maui.
Yeah.
Are you noticing any, like Hawaii's an island system, obviously, and so it's geographically constrained in a way that like the contiguous US isn't. And I'm wondering if you're noticing any like place-based like reticence to move out like because of that, or just like how like the nature of Maui being an island is like affecting anything you're finding.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think people have their options constrained in a lot of cases, which is a big piece of it. There's not a lot of places they can go that offer them that. So a lot of people went to Kihei, which if you know Maui at all, like Lahaina's up here and Kihei's down here. And that's the other kind of affordable community. And a lot of people have settled there and said, I don't know if I'm going to leave or not. And actually FEMA put a lot of their housing in Kihei. And so a lot of people really got kind of integrated there. The other place where people go is Vegas, which is interesting, right? So a lot of people from Hawaii go to Vegas and vice versa. You get the same amenities, they say. And a lot of the communities is kind of set up. So that was another thing we heard a lot, was that there was a destination that they could go to and feel comfortable, where you don't have that in a lot of these cases. So I think there was some of that, but I do think it just constrains their ability to do anything. So a lot of the recovery was slowed down because they had nowhere to put the debris, and the debris is toxic. And they had a deal made with a local landowner, and then he backed out of it. And so they had to sit on the debris for 3 or 4 months. And corruption is also a big conversation piece there, is we heard a lot about corrupt officials and not being able to move things. And institutional capacity was another big thing we heard. So we went to do the town halls. Honestly, I was the most nervous about that one, because being someone from the continental US, I didn't know how they would take hearing things from me. And that's why I was glad we had great community partners. But what was funny was the first thing that someone said to us at the end of it was, thank you so much for coming here and doing this. We are a rural island and we don't have the resources to do this. I'm glad you're paying attention to this. Right? Which is kind of the opposite of what I was expecting, which was very nice for them to say. But that does also challenge their recovery. Is their capacity to kind of manage those things, to do permitting, to think about how you end up getting a water main connection, which supposedly takes about 20 years right now if you're building a new home. So then how do you do all this so quickly? Becomes a big challenge. It's a good question.
In your own work and or in the literature, could you comment on how the ignition source maybe affects how people perceive the fire, like as a natural cycle or as like a consequence of human-based action?
Yeah, and so it's a really good question. That's something I was really interested in when I started it, was I said, I want this diversity and ignition source, because all this literature about corrosive communities coming after technological or purposive events, and so many of these fires look different. And so in Lake County just alone, you have the whole gamut, right? There was this arsonist that set like 4 of those fires. It was the same guy, and they eventually caught him. But there was lightning, there was a truck that was dragging chains. You kind of had the whole gamut of ignition sources. And we haven't went through the data just looking at that in particular, but I will say I was struck in the interviews at how much that didn't seem to matter. People didn't seem to care. They'd tell us like it was interesting to them. But fire is just such a part of the experience living out there that I don't think the source really mattered as much as we might think it does. Now, the place that changes is when PG&E is involved and there's a settlement, because the settlement was so different in the counties. So Dixie Fire was PG&E, and so was Camp Fire. And Camp Fire, they're still fighting legislation. They did. They had it locked up in stocks, and there's a stock person that sells the stocks, and they get their payouts from it. And so that's been very contentious because now you're tying survivors' future to PG&E stock. In Greenville, they just did a flat rate per square foot, and that was much quicker, and people seem to be much happier with that. But that did matter. So if there was a company you could point to, that mattered. If there was an arson, I didn't see as much of that mattering. It's a good question.
So you mentioned like policy ramifications or like implications in terms of recovery efforts. And I was also wondering, do you see any sort of therapeutic applications of this data in terms of like the mental health care that would be offered to survivors? It seems like a lot of this information could be informative to what sort of support they would need after the fire.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think we explored that all that much, but it's an interesting question. And we were trying to be as closely integrated with communities as we could be. So we did have a lot of the local social workers helping us recruit and talking to individuals, telling us who might be willing to talk and ready to talk. So it's a big part of our approach. And we certainly shared things with them. But that is something we probably be more purposeful about, is seeing how this could be therapeutic for people. We always heard people say, I was nervous about talking to you about talking about this, but I feel much better now that I did, and I'm glad that you care about it. But I do think we could be a little personal thinking about how that might be used in the future for that. So it's a good question.
We have time for one more. Maybe Kate, you had your hand up for a bit.
Thanks for your talk. I learned a lot. At the start of your talk, you were talking about the sort of 3 different pathways of either rebuilding without mitigation, with mitigation, or relocating. Did you consider how far people relocated? Because you're also talking about like scale in terms of place identity.
Yeah, I wish we had more people relocated, so we probably do that a little bit more. We know where they went, so we could parse it that way. But we didn't take that too much into account. And a lot of it was people moved in with family somewhere else. And so, we had people that went to Tennessee. There was this big move to Gatlinburg, I think, because it reflects a lot of what they had. And I'm from that area, so I knew that pretty well. But we didn't think too terribly much about that. But I will say one thing with that typology that didn't work as well as I thought it would was when you say rebuilding in the same way, no one did that because the building code changed so much when they built their home. So everyone's using hardy board now. Everyone is making sure that there's no wood touching their house and their fence. No one can put plants up on their house anymore. But there were degrees to which people went. And so we are able to talk about that of, did you go up to code or did you go beyond code? And what did you do beyond code and what motivated you to do that? And so we're doing another paper working on now using protection motivation theory to see what drives people to go much further. Because we did have those extreme cases like, $700-900 per square foot. Then we had other people say, I just did exactly what I was told to do. And we had a fire, so it's not going to happen again. It's like Gambar's fallacy for people. So we had that too.
Well, I think Dr. Greer is staying for lunch. So please follow him over there. And again, so much. Great talk.